Hello, robust Scrum product owners. Welcome to Sprint Planning. Let's start off by going through what the Scrum Guide says the sprint planning meeting is about, and then we'll focus on specific practices for you to consider on your team. So the Scrum Guide addresses three things: what can be delivered during a sprint, how will it be delivered, and what is the sprint goal. So we'll go through those items first, and then we'll talk about specific practices for each one. Here's the Scrum Guide's overview of sprint planning. Remember that you can get this at scrumguides.org. I've put in bold certain items that I want you as the product owner to focus on. So the sprint begins with sprint planning, and the result of the sprint planning meeting is a plan that is created by the entire Scrum team. Sprint planning is time-boxed to a maximum of 8 hours for a 1-month sprint. Remember that because it's going to be a quiz question. And during sprint planning, 2 questions are answered. Number 1 is what can be delivered, and number 2, how will the work be delivered? Let's take each of those in turn. So topic number 1 is what can be done in this sprint. So the development team forecasts the functionality. It used to be the case that the development team would make a commitment. We no longer use that language. We now forecast the functionality. The product owner, that's you, you're responsible for discussing the objective of the sprint and which PBIs will lead to meeting that objective if they're completed correctly. Okay? So that's what you need to be prepared to do going into sprint planning, and that's the goal of all of the refinement work that you're doing. And we discussed refinement in the last module. The entire team is working together to understand the work of the sprint. So you as the product owner are responsible for having the product backlog ready and refined. The development team understands the software that it's developed so far, and then also understands how much work they believe they can get done during a sprint. Critically, the number of items selected from the backlog is solely up to the development team. As the product owner, you shouldn't try to cajole or convince the development team to do more work. And then after the team forecasts the PBIs, then it crafts a sprint goal. And the sprint goal is a unifying objective that gives the development team guidance on why it is building the increment. And remember, that's the entire Scrum team. That's you, the product owner, the Scrum development team, and the Scrum Master work together on crafting this sprint goal. Once you've figured out what's going to be done, you have to answer the question, how will it be done? And this is primarily this responsibility of the development team. So it has to define how it will build the functionality and get it to done. And so the PBIs, selected for this sprint, plus the plan for delivering them, those 2 items together are called the sprint backlog. Okay, and so the development team typically goes through a set of steps. They have to sometimes estimate the effort. Okay, sometimes they have to forecast what can be done in the upcoming sprint. Okay, typically they will decompose the work that they're doing during the first few days of the sprint down into little tiny tasks or unit of work. The development team is self-organizing. So part 2 is primarily about the development team figuring out how it's going to do the work. But you do have a critical role, namely, you will help to clarify the backlog items. So typically during part 1, you're playing a very active role. During part 2, you're in the room and you're listening to the development team and they can ask you questions. And you can help them make trade-offs. And then by the end of topic 2, the development team needs to be able to explain to you how they're going to execute on the sprint backlog items. And they're responsible for doing this on an ongoing basis throughout the sprint. And the final topic is the sprint goal. So at the end of the meeting, once everything has been decided, you decide on a sprint goal, which is typically a sentence or two that describes at a high level what the team will be delivering. And it gives the development team some flexibility about what PBIs, what functionality they will implement within the sprint. Okay, and so if the work turns out to be different than what the development team expected, they may negotiate with you to change the sprint backlog within the sprint. So that's the top level view of what the sprint planning meeting is. Let's turn now to practices. Okay, starting with what can be delivered during a sprint. So the standard approach is to calculate based on story points. I'm sure you're familiar with this method. So there are story points assigned to each user story. The total number of story points that the team can complete in a sprint is called the velocity, and the team uses the velocity to plan its next sprint. Note that if everything is ready going into sprint planning, this takes 15 minutes. It should not be a long discussion. Now, the pro approach to this is to use historical throughput data to create a forecast. And so that means that no estimation is needed whatsoever. And you can look at the refinement module to get more information about that. Now, there's an intermediate approach between the standard approach and the pro approach, where you simply focus on recognizing that there's variance. Remember that the standard approach says this is how many points we can finish, and it's an average estimate. It doesn't recognize that sometimes you'll finish fewer points and sometimes you'll finish more. So if you're moving from the standard approach and want to get a more in-depth understanding of what's possible during a sprint, that's the next step that I would suggest, that you recognize variance. And I'll be going through the Focused Objectives Basic Statistics worksheet on the next slide to show you how to do that. Remember that no matter what approach you use, the development team decides the work that can be taken into the sprint. This is part of the Scrum pull system. The product owner does not push work to the team, the development team decides. So let's take a look at this spreadsheet. This is just a screenshot, but I will now pull it up. And the goal of this spreadsheet is for you to understand the variance, the uncertainty inside of a sprint. So a team doesn't deliver exactly 50 points per sprint. They deliver between 35 and 65 points in a sprint. And understanding that variance is very valuable for both the team and for you as the product owner. Okay, so here's the part where I would suggest that you start with. Your data goes here, as it says down here on the tab. And the data that I suggest putting in here is how many story points your team can finish in a sprint. If you ever get more advanced, it could just be the number of stories. 42 points, 40 points, 43 points, and 39 points. You can have as many data points here as you want, up to a maximum of 500. Now you go to data analysis. And data analysis shows you a whole bunch of information about your sprints, okay? And in particular, it shows you a histogram, okay? And the histogram gives you some sense of the spread of your story points. It also gives you information on outliers and ranks. The part that I want you to focus on is Monte Carlo. So change cell B3 to 1. And what this does is it gives you a sense of how many points will be finished in a sprint. So here is the average, 37 points. This is normally the number of story points that would be used in the standard approach. You'd say, we're going to get 37 points done. But note at the additional information you get from using this spreadsheet and recognizing variance. Okay? What it says is that the confidence interval between 10% and 90%, that's where 80% of the probability falls into. I'm getting that 80% by subtracting 90% and 10%. It ranges from 29 to 43. So that's a significant range, right? 43 is more than 40% more than 29. So you as the product owner should recognize that 10% of the time, 29 or fewer points will get done. 25% of the time, 35 points or fewer will get done. And on the flip side, 10% of the time, 43 or more points will get done. So simply understanding this variance gives you a much richer understanding of the capacity of the team and helps you make better decisions. So let's go back now to the presentation. Another key practice is to create a task board. The task board is typically user stories or PBIs with tasks. And the standard approach is to have 3 columns: to do, in progress, or done, or not started, in progress, or done, as you see here. Note that during the sprint planning meeting, the development team does not need to think about all of the tasks. So you see here, they've got tasks only for the top 3 of the user stories in the sprint. They will add tasks during the sprint. So that's the standard approach. I'm going to suggest 2 ways to enhance this. Way number 1 is to think about the board not just as a to-do list, but as a model of the way of working. So here you see a more sophisticated board, which shows information that is expedited, active projects, and maintenance and support. In addition, there's a review section where the work is reviewed. First it's in progress, then it's done. And then before the work gets started, there's a design and triage stage. So whatever it is that you're actually doing to finish the work, the process from the commit point to the finish point is what you represent on the board. This gives you a much richer understanding of your way of work and more visibility. And then you can use this information to improve the way of work, which would then cause you to change the board. A second thing I want to suggest to you is that just as the development team is tracking its work, you as the product owner can also visualize your work. So in determining business value module in this course, we talked about hypothesis-driven development, in which you as the product owner validate the user stories and the work that you're doing. So that precedes the development work in the sprint. And then afterwards, you validate that you've actually created the business value. You run an experiment and either accept or reject. And so normally, development teams just visualize the work inside of the delivery part. What I'm suggesting is that you visualize the entire end-to-end system. So here's an example of that. You start off with a pool of ideas. Maybe you create a business case. Maybe you do requirements analysis, and so on and so forth. And then finally, you commit. So normally, you would only show this part on your task board. What I'm suggesting is that you show the upstream work here, and then you also show downstream work after the work has been delivered to the customer and you're validating the business value. So here's another way of showing that. You start off with personas. You describe user journeys through the system. You then break it down into epics. You do design. You decide on constraints. And then finally, you move into a sprint. So normally, all of this upstream work is not visualized, and I'm suggesting that you might want to visualize it. So this is how work will be delivered. Let's go on finally to the sprint goal. Here's a great template from romanpickler.com, which describes a way to represent or capture the sprint goal. The goal itself is here, just a couple of sentences, no need to get super elaborate, and then how the goal is being met in a broad sense and what metrics are being used. So here's some bad examples of a sprint goal. Finish all the user stories. Don't produce any bugs. Collaborate effectively with design. So typically, those won't be sprint goals, right? Sprint goals are about delivery and value creation. So good examples are the customer can pay with a credit card, customers can log in, small business customers can see receivables. Remember, the sprint goal is a collaborative effort by the entire Scrum team. So here's the next steps. In the next video, you will use the focused objective spreadsheet that I shared with you in this video to better understand your sprint planning. So you'll actually do this for your upcoming sprint planning. And then do not hesitate to contact me for your one-on-one session. There are many ideas here that you can run by me, and we can figure out how to get them to work for you on your team. Enjoy.